Have you ever wondered what it took to build a ranch so vast it stretched farther than the eye could see? What kind of grit does it take to survive the blizzards, droughts, and market crashes of the Canadian frontier? And how did one brand, the Bar U, rise from the lonely foothills of Alberta to become a symbol of ranching greatness across the nation? This is the story of the Bar U Ranch, a place where men, horses, and land carved a legacy out of raw wilderness. A ranch that bred champions, weathered storms, and stood the test of more than a century. From open-range empires to the modern heritage site it is today, the Bar U Ranch remains a living monument to Canada's ranching heart. Let's ride back in time to where it all began, the wild Alberta foothills of 1882. Sunrise on the foothills, setting the stage. In the 1880s, the Canadian West was a wild frontier of endless grass and towering Rockies. The federal government sought to assert sovereignty and feed a growing nation by leasing huge tracts of southern Alberta ranchland for a penny an acre. Entrepreneurs answered the call. One of the first and grandest of these new operations was the Bar U Ranch. Its headquarters nestled between the rolling Porcupine Hills and the Rocky Mountains, forever shaped by the Chinook winds. Here, the Bar U would become synonymous with the prairie cowboy era, eventually spreading over 158,000 acres of open range and running tens of thousands of stock. In 1882, stockman Frederick S. Stimson formed the Northwest Cattle Company with wealthy Montreal investors and secured leases totaling about 147,000 acres in the foothills of Alberta. He stamped the herds with the Bar U brand and stocked them with 3,000 Durham Shorthorn steers, 21 purebred Shorthorn bulls, and 75 saddle horses. Stimson became the on-site manager, hiring experienced riders, even young John Ware, later a legend, and future outlaw Harry Sundance Kid Longabaugh, to wrangle stock on the broad, unfenced ranges. At first, the Bar U had few buildings, a simple cookhouse, bunkhouse, and corrals clustered by Pekisco Creek. Grass was king here, and horses and men worked the land much as indigenous bison hunters had before. Stimson kept the cattle on the move with the seasons, breaking winter herds early and letting them drift to better pastures, a practice that spared the Bar U huge losses in the bitter winter of 1882-83 when a nearby ranch lost 3,000 head. By the late 1880s, the Bar U was booming. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway brought new markets, and in 1887, Bar U ranchers were driving herds to railway stockyards or even shipping beef to England. Stimson's operation continued to grow. In 1890, the Bar U covered about 158,000 acres of leased acres, with over 10,000 cattle on the range. Still, ranch life remained harsh. Cowboys spent long nights under cottonwood trees during fall roundups, firing up a chuck wagon oven and brewing campfire coffee as blizzards swept the open plains. They branded calves with red-hot irons and hauled winter fodder by sleigh, all while barbed wire fences slowly began to shrink the open frontier. A turning point came in 1902. The Allen family, majority owners of the Northwest Cattle Company, sold the Bar U to foreman George Lane and partners for $220,000. Lane, a flamboyant and ambitious rancher, renamed it the Bar U Ranch and poured money into breeding. Under his leadership, the Bar U achieved international renown as a center of livestock excellence. Lane imported Percheron stallions and mares from France, eventually assembling the world's largest herd of these gentle giants. By 1909, Bar U horses were sweeping the world's livestock expositions. The black Percherons, strong enough to pull threshing engines or freight wagons, became Bar U's signature stock, alongside prize-winning Shorthorn cattle. Infrastructure at the ranch expanded accordingly. New log barns and farrowing sheds were built for the horse herds, while additional bunkhouses and corrals supported dozens of ranch hands and cowboys. The Bar U under Lane was the hub of a sprawling business empire. Beside cattle and horses, the owners ran meatpacking plants, flour mills, and other ranches across Alberta. Even British royalty took notice.
In 1919, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, toured the Bar-U and was so entranced he named his own Alberta spread the EP Ranch. The ranch's portraits and livestock records from this era tell of champagne breakfasts in the grazing pasture and glittering inspections of stallions. By the end of Lane's tenure, around 1925, the Bar-U was at its peak. About 65,000 hectares, roughly 160,000 acres, managed with some 30,000 cattle grazing the open hills. Global turmoil in the 1930s and 40s brought new challenges. In 1927, George Lane sold the Bar-U to Alberta meat magnate Patrick Burns. Burns proved a savvy and resilient owner. When the Great Depression struck, he slashed operating costs and invested only in essentials. Most large ranches collapsed, but Burns cut expenditures, deferred debts, and even irrigated some fields to boost hay production. The ranch's scale shrank. Horse-mounted roundups gave way to tractors and motor trucks. One by one, Percheron mares and stallions were sold off or retired. By World War II, the old horse barns had been pressed into service for grain storage as the Bar-U grew huge cereal crops to aid the war effort. Despite hardship, the Bar-U remained among Canada's largest ranches through 1950. Its long-lived herds adapted, and cowboy culture endured, even as some ranch hands left to enlist. Burns drew on connections with First Nations communities to recruit riders and ranch hands when others went off to war. He also mechanized swiftly. As storybook images of horse teams gradually faded, tractors and trucks took over prairie work. By 1950, after 2 world wars and economic swings, Burns's heirs began selling off land. Much of the original spread was parceled out to neighboring ranchers and farmers.
In the post-war boom, the Bar-U's ownership changed hands. In 1950, most of the estate was sold to rancher Alan Baker. Decades later, the core ranch was passed to other private owners. By the 1970s and 80s, the historic headquarters and homestead stood largely idle on just a few hundred acres. However, the story of the Bar-U was far from over. Heritage advocates had begun to recognize the site's uniqueness. In 1989, the Bar-U was officially designated a National Historic Site of Canada. Then, in the early 1990s, Parks Canada stepped in to save this ranching legacy. After lengthy talks in 1991, the government purchased the old headquarters and 148 hectares of land. On July 30, 1995, the Bar-U Ranch National Historic Site officially opened to the public. The choice was clear. Of all the old ranches in Alberta's foothills, the Bar-U was one of Canada's most famous and, at one time, one of its largest at nearly 158,000 acres. It also boasted the country's richest collection of original ranch buildings, the biggest anywhere in Canada. Today, the Bar-U lives on as a living museum of the Old West. Parks Canada maintains over 35 historic structures, from blacksmith and harness shops to the old cookhouse, so visitors can step back into the 1900s. Wagon rides drawn by majestic Percheron teams roll past the workhorse and stud horse barns, buildings originally built for those very horses. Inside, interpreters in period dress demonstrate chores. You can watch a farrier shoe a draft horse, smell bannock baking in the wood stove, or see leather goods being hand-stitched just as cowboys once did. In the meadows and along Pequisco Creek, children can try roping a dummy steer or watch ranch horse herds at pasture. Interpreters portray everything from cooks in the chuck wagon at Roundup Camp to storytellers around the campfire, keeping legends alive, tales of cowboys, royal visits, and even of John Ware and the Sundance Kid. This site, the only Parks Canada location that commemorates the importance of ranching to Canada, lets visitors sense the seasonal rhythms, the spring calves in tall grass, summer haying, autumn roundups, and quiet snowy winters that defined prairie ranch life. In its 140-year history, the Bar-U Ranch weathered droughts, booms, depressions, and wars to outlast nearly all its peers. Unlike most 19th-century empires of range, it survives intact as a bridge between past and present. Every summer, visitors from across Alberta and the world stroll its original plank floors, hear horse hooves on the corrals, and breathe in the mountain air that once spurred the pioneers. The Bar-U stands today as Canada's premier landmark of ranching heritage. Here, beneath the western sky, the cowboy way of life lives on, a story forever written in sweat, soil, and those rolling foothills.